ones direct the content. They are the ones that tell you what kind of content you should be preparing for your student, in which format sometimes. The second thing, they are the ones that tells you about what kind of assessment you're going to be doing. And they're the ones that tells you what kind of teaching strategies are going to be using. These three elements are very important, and then they direct, of course, what needs to be assessed. Now, as I told you, there are three types of outcomes. I'm sure that you already know that. If you wanted to see examples of learning outcomes, as an example, you would say, a knowledge outcome, as an example from this workshop, would be that by the end of the workshop, participants will be able to describe various types of student assessment. Which means that you are only able to describe summative, what formative, what diagnostic assessment is. You're not able to apply it, and I can achieve that by only lecturing, because it only relies on your memorization. How much did you remember? But if I wanted to have a skill outcome, it means that you have the knowledge. This next level is to be able to apply it. So an example would be that by the end of this workshop, you will be able to articulate smart learning outcomes using Bloom's taxonomy, which means you have the knowledge about Bloom's taxonomy, but you come and you are able of writing a smart learning outcome for the courses that you are teaching. That's a skill outcome. And a value outcome, which is really the most challenging ones, to be honest, is what you believe in, the values you instill in your students. Like you would say, by the end of this workshop, you will be able to identify your position on integrating digital technologies in learning and teaching. So it's what you value. Do you value the emergence of technology or you don't? Now, you all know this. Bloom is a researcher that has created this model in 1956. And what he said is that human brain, or that we learn, that our learning is sequential, which means that each level leads to another level. And what he said is that learning is split into 6 steps. The first one is knowledge. What is knowledge? It's the student's ability. It's the student's ability to remember things. Okay? So knowledge is what is the student's ability to remember things. I just can remember. I say, what is the definition of student-centric? You're capable of remembering what student-centric means. That's knowledge. The second level is comprehension, which means you have the knowledge, but you are capable of interpreting this knowledge in your own words and in your own definition, right? The third level is basically what we call application. You have the knowledge, you can interpret the knowledge, but you are capable of applying the knowledge in specific contexts. These 3 levels are usually what we call the lower level thinking. And what Bloom has said, for each one of these levels there is a set of verbs. So for each one, and this is what my colleague is distributing them to you now, is that if you wanted knowledge, your learning outcome will be verbs starting with list, define, describe, identify, and so forth. If you wanted comprehension, you might tell the student, write in your own words or whatever. If you were talking about application, you will ask the students to apply the theory of this and this into this context. So what he's saying, Bloom, is that for each one, there is a whole list of verbs that you are going to have now. Now, this is what you usually call the lower level thinking, and the criticism of higher education is that we emphasize too much on only the lower level thinking, and we don't do much on the higher level thinking. They say the higher level, which is usually the first 3 levels, that can be done the traditional way of lecturing and so forth. The higher level, it's really where you look at authentic learning. Students not just copying what is in the textbook and slides, learning, the students being able to analyze, to create new things and so forth. And they say the 4th level is about analysis, how to structure things. The 5th is about synthesizing, how does this relate to something, relate the Newton theories to whatever it is. And the last one is evaluation, that the student has all the knowledge, the application, and is able to evaluate and take a stand on something, and to justify that evaluation. This is what we call Bloom's taxonomies. Now, they need to write learning outcomes. They are also used to think about your teaching strategies, and this is why I'm talking about them, not because of learning outcomes. In the sheet that you all have a sheet, I think now that was distributed from my colleague, you will see there is the levels of the Bloom's taxonomy, the verbs, and then the next column is actually the kind of questions questions that you may be asking in an exam or in an activity, the students, so that you can evaluate the outcome. And the last column is the instructional strategies that will help you achieve that particular level. So that is why Bloom's job doesn't end up with writing the learning outcome, but it continues when you're thinking about the assessment. It continues when you're thinking about what? About what? About what?
Assessment.
About the assessment, and what else? And the instructional strategies, exactly. Now, Bloom's job has been slightly revised in, I think, 1982 by one of his students and one of the original authors. And what they say, it's just slight change. The revised is called, people will find it as revised Bloom's taxonomy, and that's why you will see the order is different in the paper that you have. What they say is that they have changed the names to verbs in light of promoting active learning. Because they say a noun does not promote active learning. So it went on from being knowledge to remember, from comprehension to understand, from application to apply. So they became verbs, active verbs. The second thing they say is that they say the higher top of the pyramid is the creation, the ability of an individual to create things on the basis of knowledge that they have. Create a design, create a prototype, create a program, solve an unfamiliar problem. Students cannot do that until they have achieved all the 5 first levels. So they inverted the last 2 to have evaluation and then creation at the highest level. Now you know what happened? It didn't end up here. Because they say now there are technologies, and technologies are being used and affecting our life. Somebody who would study a bachelor's in marketing will probably be taking a course on digital marketing. And as a marketing person who uses digital marketing, social media is important and blogging is important, right? So they said in light of the emergence of this new technology, there is an extension to the taxonomy that is called the digital Bloom's taxonomy. It's the same list of verbs, but they added new verbs. So for instance, what they say, in creation, the student might be able to blog about a specific topic or subject. So blog has become a verb added to the creation list. As an example, if you were working in programming, you might have one of your learning outcomes that students are able to debug a program. So debugging is actually part of the analysis bit. So what they did, they extended the original list to include new verbs that reflect the emergence of new educational tools. Not only this, in some other versions or amended version, they have mapped that in order to achieve each one of these levels, there are specific tools that are available to help you achieve the level. As an example, if you were teaching, you have Blackboard here, right? Does everybody have access to Blackboard at the university? Yes. Everybody, right? Now, in Blackboard, there are lots of social communication tools. Wikis and blogs and discussion forum. What they're saying, if you are looking at developing student creation skills, you might be using a blog or ask the students to do a podcast. If you wanted to improve students' understanding, you might be using journaling or even simple things like tweeting. So what they're saying that at the end, it's not that technology is just a tool. You just find which is the best technology to be used in which specific context. And this is what we call actually the digital Bloom's taxonomy. Now, you've done the learning outcomes, you thought about if there is a technology you want to integrate, you've already started thinking of. So if you wanted students to blog or debug or hack or whatever, you've already included that in your learning outcome. Then you're thinking about your assessment. Now your assessment, there are usually, what are the types of assessment that we have? Without looking at the notes, what types of assessment do we have? I need an answer from that gentleman there who attended with me something before. You don't have your notes?
I have a lot.
You have a lot. What are the types of assessment? Formative?
And summative.
And summative. What's the difference between both?
Summative is usually done by the end of the year. Formative is usually done during the learning process.
Okay. Anybody else? Summative at the end of an, okay. End of what? So midterm is summative or formative? Are you sure?
Summative is
is a number, but formative is feedback.
Okay, let me tell you something. Usually there are 3 types of assessment. And I've asked you these questions before. I'll come back to this slide in a bit. But there are usually 3 types of assessment. The ones that you commonly know are the formative and summative assessment. The purpose of this assessment is different, and this is where the difference comes in. It's not about really what time does it happen. It's really about the objective of the assessment. Formative assessment can be graded, but the purpose of formative assessment is usually that you are doing it for the purpose of improving learning, which means that as the student do the formative assessment, you should be able to give them feedback so that they can improve their learning. And this is why we often call it the assessment for learning. So the purpose, you might give it a small grade, usually they're low stakes comparing to summative assessment. Summative assessment has a different objective. Summative assessment is usually what we call assessment of learning. And the purpose is to validate that the student have learned and to give them a grade. So the objective of these 2 are different. Now, formative might lead to summative assessment. It doesn't, a midterm exam is a summative assessment. Why is it summative? It's not because it happens at the end of the semester or the mid of the semester. Summative means that you are assessing the student after giving them some dose of knowledge. Once you're doing that summative assessment, you're not going to go back to that knowledge. You're going to move on. But formative means I am giving them knowledge, I gave them a formative assessment, they didn't do well, so I am going to go and revisit and readapt my learning. And that is why we say it sums the knowledge you have given them, and that's why it's called summative assessment. Now, some formative might lead to summative. As an example, you give the student a project, they have a group, an individual or group project or an assignment, at the end of the semester that is 40 points. And you say, out of the 40 points, every week I want to validate that the student has learned. So every week they have to keep a log on a blog, on Blackboard. And I'll tell you more about blogs in a bit. And they have to write what they have done in the project, what issues they face, how they overcome it, and so forth. Now, the weekly journals that they are maintaining are formative. Which means that if I found that the student is going out of topic, I come and I give him feedback and I say, no, I think you have to relook at the work you have done and consider this and this and this. And then the student has to act upon, and you have to see the acting upon in the next log of the project, right? You might be giving 10% of the grade on the 14 weeks, 12 weeks, 10 weeks logs. And 30% of the grade is on the final project. The project as a whole is summative in nature. The weekly logs are formative assessments. And it is a very good way to authentify that students have done work and that students are acting upon feedback. Even when you have a semester project, you might not be able, you have 60 students, everyone has a log weekly, you might not see every week log, but you might randomly pick. The student doesn't know which ones you're going to see, so he's going to do all of them. You might pick the one, usually you have to pick 1 or 2 at the beginning, because you want to give them feedback so that if they are going out of the subject, or they're misunderstanding, or they're not really getting what is expected from them, you have the opportunity to give them feedback so that they improve. But you ask, when you ask students, if you have a project that you give a big weight for, 30, 40%, one thing you might want to do is ask the student to maintain weekly logs. And the best thing in terms of technology is to use a blog for this purpose. We'll talk more about blogs in a bit. But a blog which is in Blackboard, you don't have to get anything outside. It's very easy to use, it works like Word, and it asks students to record on a weekly or daily or bi-weekly basis what they are actually doing in their project. The diagnostic assessment comes back to what our colleagues have said. Do you do diagnostic assessment? Yeah, you do?
Yeah,
You started? Okay. After March or before March? After March. Okay. So diagnostic assessment, what does diagnostic assessment mean? Means being able, usually you don't give a grade for diagnostic assessment. Being able to give a grade for student, being able to evaluate the student incoming skills. You're teaching a course on statistics or operational research. Very often your students are weak in math. They come with a weak background, and then you inherit them in university. They go to prep year, it's still weak, and then you get them there and they're still weak. When you have a diagnostic assessment at the beginning of your course, it allows you to know the level of the students and helps you really maybe give them some additional material, maybe some tutorials, maybe meet them in office hours, maybe give them extra reading depending on what you are teaching exactly. But it tells you a bit of the level of the student. The other thing, you can use diagnostic assessment when you are teaching courses that increase in complexity. So when you move to chapter 3, you want to actually have a small quiz to assess if the student grasped all the knowledge and understanding of chapter 2. Now you're going to tell me I don't have time to do all these things. Well, one of the things is that most of the publishers, Prentice Hall, McGraw-Hill, Pearson and all, with the textbook that you use, and also you're going to be using it from one of these big publishers, they have banks of questions. You know, they have banks of thousands of questions, depending on the textbook, so it's related to the textbook. These banks of questions, you can integrate them with Blackboard. Once they are in Blackboard, you can administer an online quiz in 3 minutes. You pick from the bank of questions, you might have different versions to students. Remember, you're not doing to grade students, you're doing it to know their level, right? So you're pushing the quiz to the student, you don't have to correct it, the system will correct it, and will produce to you a report to tell you how the student have performed. And this is the beauty of technology. If you didn't have the bank of questions, you're teaching the same course as he is, you might each one prepare some questions and put them in a bank. Every time you offer the course, you will end up building a huge bank of questions. And these tests, the students get them on their system, they go through it, it's usually true, false, multiple, fill in the blanks, short answers, and so forth. And with the exception of short answers, they're automatically corrected by the system. It is a very useful tool also if you give students to read a case study, or you gave them some material to read, and you want to make sure before they come to the classroom, you want to check their understanding. You might give them a quiz. Usually these quizzes are timed so that students don't have time to go and open a book. So it's 1 minute per question. The student can, and then students have multiple versions and all. They can do it at home. It will pop up on their Blackboard system. They'll take the quiz, they'll press submit, you will get the results. Okay, you can do it even in the classroom. Your Blackboard has a mobile application. You could even do it in the classroom. And it will help you know when the students come into the classroom, if they have read the material first, if they have understood the material. If you found out there were 2 questions where most of the students didn't answer right, then it means in the time of the class, you might want to spend some time addressing those concepts related to the 2 questions. That's why online quizzes are very useful. They don't need to be used to do a midterm exam or a final. Obviously, you can still have a protected exam if you didn't wanted to save the time of correcting and all. You can bring the student in the lab and supervise the student. They do the exam online, the system corrects it for you, you get the result. You can have 5, 6 versions of your exam. The machine will shuffle the questions and the answer orders for you. It's all there in Blackboard, nothing new. It's there in the technology that you already have. Yes?
Based on a personal experience,
yes.
Here, we have to make it in class, not at home. The real one, which I made, it was in class.
Yes.
When I make this at home, this was not...
It depends what is the purpose of doing it. If you're doing it to give a grade,
no.
You might want to do it in class.
Yeah.
But if you're doing it to assess students, you might not necessarily have the time in class or the facilities or the laboratory. Yeah, it really depends, but still if you did it outside of the classroom, usually the way you design the quiz is that students have very limited time so that they cannot cheat. It's really recalling and making sure that they have a clear understanding. And it's really to tell you when you come to the class, did the student go through the material you asked them to go through? 1, and is there any misunderstanding or unclarity on the subject? So when you're using the class time, you're using the class time to clarify those kind of things. Does anybody use peer and self-assessment? Peer and self-assessment. See, when you're talking about student centricity, remember what we say? It's about students taking responsibility for their learning. It's about learning from each other. It's about, well, that means that we have to start the practice. Now, peer assessment means what? Means that students are capable of learning from each other. Students evaluate the work of each other. The main problem that I face with peer assessment is that people say, How am I going to give a grade on the basis of what the students are biased and, you know, you're my friend, I give you a grade. And there are techniques and ways to do that. When you start doing peer assessment, don't start to do it for grading purposes. Start creating the culture as a learning activity. I asked this group to work on something, right? Right? Just like you worked before. And I asked this group to work on something. Instead of me correcting it, when the activity is finished, I create a small rubric, you know, guidelines, and I tell this group, give it to these students, and this is the rubric, evaluate their work, and they will take their work and evaluate it. Then they will come and sit together, and they will discuss it. There is no grading, it's a learning activity. Once students get practice with that, then you might want to use it for grading. Even when you use it for grading, whether it's self-assessment or peer assessment, what happens? Because remember, you want to develop reflective skills. Self-assessment is important. So you always might want to try with self-assessment first, then peer assessment. What do you do with it? You come and say, okay, I will tell the students to peer assess themselves. And technology, again, inside Blackboard, there is a module that is called peer assessment. What happens, it allows you to create an activity, like an assessment. And once the students submit, you allocate to who is this activity going to go. The student gets the activity anonymously, so they don't know who they are evaluating and grading. And Blackboard allows you to develop a rubric online. So the student gets the exercise or the activity of their colleague along the rubric. They go and evaluate it, they submit it, it comes back to you. Now, if you're planning to grade it anyways, in all cases you would have graded. To start the practice, you grade the student work. Then you compare your grade with the grade of that the student has given. If you find that the grade is inflated or below, it means that the student either haven't understood the rubric or there was some buy-in. They will lose 1 grade or 2 grades. That is how you start creating the culture. You don't start by saying, you're going to grade each other and I'm not going to look at it. Well, in all cases, you're going to be correcting it. So you get the students to do it. Same thing with self-assessment. Do you use rubrics? Do you use rubrics? All of you? When you give students a project or an assignment, do you give them a sheet with it saying that these are the criteria that you're going to use for evaluating it? Now, rubrics are not scoring tools. Rubrics are learning tools. They are guides. When I give students a project or an assignment, I should give him the rubric with it, right? And this is why we use rubrics for students so that they can actually, learn how to reflect on their learning. So you might come and say, every student who is working on an assignment, you need to work on your assignment. We want you to evaluate your work against the rubric. You submit the rubric evaluation and the assignment. And you can do it on Blackboard. You don't have to do papers and so forth. You can have one rubric you design, it's pushed to the student with the assessment on the assignment tool. And then once the students get it, you ask them to submit Blackboard, they submit their assignment through Blackboard, they submit their rubric, their own self-assessment and evaluation, and the assignment. That will help you do 2 things. First thing, ensure that students read the criteria and know that on which basis they're going to be evaluated. Second thing, building student self-reflection skills. I did something, then I went back, I said, and I evaluated what I did against what the rubric is. So when you're thinking about active learning, you need to think about the assessment that is creative, the assessment that is authentic. What do we mean by authentic assessment? And I'm going to come back to the authentic assessment here. It means that as much as possible, the assessment has to be linked to real life scenario and case study. If we're sometimes we say students plagiarize. That's great, students plagiarize. Yes, it is a major issue. But you know what happens? Sometimes we're encouraging students to plagiarize. We give the same project every semester to every group of students that we have. It's like we're telling them, go take it from the other group. We need to design assessments that are creative and that reduces the opportunity of students being able to plagiarize. Assessments that relates to individual situations, to individual reflection. Where a student, we might be working both of us on the topic, but you're asking me to reflect on my own own understanding, on my own interpretation. So we cannot reflect the same way. And this is how you actually authentify student work. So when you're designing assessment for active learning, you need to design assessment that is creative, assessment that is authentic, assessment that is basically not always done for the purpose of giving a grade, but that will also be done for the purpose of helping the student improve their performance. You need to consider things like peer and self-assessment. That is how you are implementing active and student-centric learning. So you are thinking of it, not just in your teaching, but also in the way you are designing your assessment strategies. Now, remember one thing. When you're designing assessment, you need to think about your learning outcome, you need to think about your student characteristics and context, and you need to think about the tools available. You think about the best assessment. Let's try and think, is there a technology that can help me? If I wanted to do peer assessment and self-assessment using paper and pencil, and I had 80 students in my class, it would be very challenging. But I have technology that helps me. But you don't start by saying, the technology is there, how am I going to use it? No, you start thinking about what you want to achieve. Then you see, is there a technology that helps me to do that? We talk a lot about student participation and student expressing themselves and student researching. One amazing tool and basic tool that is available in Blackboard are discussion forums. And I'll tell you about discussion forums and how they can be used to really develop students' collaborative communication, writing skills, critical thinking skills, evaluation skills. You could use them almost in every context. But it comes back to how well do you write the question, how well do you moderate it, how well do you provide guidelines for students, and how do you link it to the learning outcomes of the particular course or unit that you are teaching.